Hello, I'm Dr. Deepak Bhatt here in Amsterdam at the ESC for ACC.org. Actually, I wish I were in Amsterdam. I'm in my office in Boston. I'm joined by my good colleague and friend here, Professor Gabriel Steg. He is in France, though he's actually on vacation and has been kind enough to join us. Gabriel, welcome.
Hello.
So we've got a few trials to cover today from day 3 of our wrap-up coverage. And let's start off, Gabriel, with the TWILIGHT-HBR trial. You were part of the TWILIGHT leadership. What did this study show? We already know a lot of great analyses from the TWILIGHT trial, but what did this particular analysis in high bleeding risk patients show?
So TWILIGHT, I think everybody recalls, looked at what's happening at 3 months post-PCI in a broad group of patients at high risk, both from clinical and procedural standpoint, if they discontinue aspirin or continue aspirin and while they're on ticagrelor. And the overall trial showed that stopping aspirin actually halves bleeding and has no impact on the risk of ischemic outcome. So it seems that ticagrelor alone seems to do the job after 3 months. Now, of course, because bleeding is such an important endpoint, it was important to look at what happened in patients at high bleeding risk, which is a substantial fraction of the population that undergoes PCI. And I think the results are very clear. The high bleeding risk subgroup has results that are very consistent with the overall trial results, with a substantial reduction in bleeding and no offset in terms of increase in ischemic events. But because the bleeding risk is so much higher, the absolute benefit from the ticagrelor alone strategy compared to continuing aspirin on top of ticagrelor was larger. And so if anything, this is the group where you really want to discontinue aspirin and continue with ticagrelor. I think it's helping clinicians make decisions about monotherapy post-PCI.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I mean, I think it's these high bleeding risk patients where you really want to de-escalate to monotherapy as soon as you can. So really useful data. I'll just mention the Michelle trial. This was a trial of medically ill hospitalized patients with COVID-19 and testing extended prophylaxis with rivaroxaban. So there are other data, not from COVID specifically, but medically ill hospitalized patients post-discharge where this sort of extended duration anticoagulation has seemed to be beneficial. This was studying in COVID and modest size open label trial, but it was positive. It did show significant benefit and really not much of a bleeding penalty, surprisingly, to pay in this obviously carefully selected trial population. So, some positive data. I don't know that I would necessarily just use it in everybody that has a COVID hospitalization, but I think as is consistent with older data, probably if someone's been really sick and in the hospital for a long time, you do want to consider whether they should be discharged on some sort of extended duration prophylaxis. In light of the other trials, I really think there's something to this strategy. Again, not to be used without discretion, because probably that would lead to some bleeding hazard in vulnerable patients. But in carefully selected patients, I think this trial really adds to prior non-COVID trials, saying this is a strategy to at least consider. Let me now turn it back to you, Gabriel, to talk about a couple of trials that were pertaining to COVID. It's great, I should say, to see COVID research presented at this ESC cardiology meeting. And one of them had to do with colchicine and one of them had to do with icosapent-ethyl. Neither trial met its primary endpoint, but there were interesting findings, I think, in both trials. Do you want to start with the colchicine trial?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd point out that both of these trials were led by our South American colleagues from Argentina, and the primary presenter was Professor Diaz, Rafael Diaz, from the ECLA group in Argentina. And I think it speaks volume to the way our Latin American colleagues have been conducting trials during the COVID pandemic, both in Brazil and Argentina, have been doing a terrific job with trials. So the colchicine trial looked at colchicine as an obvious method to try to address the inflammatory storm that complicates COVID in many patients and seems to be a critical step in the development of most severe complications and ultimately death. And as you know, there's been some signal, although not entirely convincing on its own, from prior studies that colchicine might be beneficial. And the trial COLCOVID actually did not show a significant, statistically significant benefit. There was a numerically lower event rate with colchicine, but not statistically significant. And when you put the evidence side by side from the previous trials, including the large British recovery trial that showed no benefit in severe patients, I think overall this argues that colchicine on its own might not be sufficient, or maybe we need to tease out which patients might derive benefit.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I was involved with this trial, and we thought there might be some modest benefit, but on top of corticosteroids, perhaps the incremental benefit is really quite modest, and we would have needed a much larger trial to see a modest benefit. Maybe that degree of modest benefit would still be useful for something that throughout most of the world is relatively cheap, not so much in the US, but the rest of the world it's relatively cheap and easily available. So, there are still ongoing studies with colchicine in COVID that may shed further light on this question. And how about PREPARE-IT-1? It's a trial both of us were involved with.
Yeah, so you were intimately involved in the design of that and performance of that trial. Again, another Argentinian trial presented by Rafael Diaz. So the trial was looking at a high-dose EPA regimen, icosapent ethyl purified omega-3 fatty acid, to see the effect on infection during the COVID pandemic. And the bottom line is that even a high dose of 8 grams per day did not have a significant effect on the rate of infection in outpatients. An interesting wrinkle to that trial is that it also provided an opportunity to look at the effect of the placebo mineral oil on biomarkers. And as you know, there's been a lot of discussion following the REDUCE-IT trial on whether mineral oil placebo is inert or not inert, and what are its biological effects, particularly on inflammation. Of note, in this trial, there was absolutely no effect of mineral oil on inflammation. So I think this is an important additional piece of information from that trial.
Yeah, and one thing that I thought was really interesting, and as you know, we designed in, was really just to test the loading dose here, of course, in people that are exposed to COVID, but just as a general principle, see is it safe? And it turned out it was as safe and well tolerated as the placebo. So I think if somebody in the future wants to do a trial with a loading dose of icosapent ethyl, maybe in acute MI or acute PCI settings or something like that, well, now there's a large database, over 1,000 patients where this has been used without any obvious bad side effect compared with a placebo. So it opens the door for a whole new line of research, which is kind of exciting. Well, I think that wraps it up for day 3. I don't think there's anything else that I wanted to bring up today, but from your perspective, I'll just ask Gabriel, all this sort of COVID research that cardiologists are involved with, I think it's good for the field. I know that you at your center have been also overseeing some COVID research. Do you think this is a sign of things to come in the future where cardiologists doing trials branch out into other areas?
Well, one of the things that cardiology has is the experience of the large, simple trials, maybe more so than other medical specialties. And I think that expertise that the cardiologists have has to be disseminated in other fields. And during a pandemic, it's a precious resource to have. Actually, there's a disproportionate representation of cardiologists among trialists doing COVID trials, well beyond the cardiology aspects of COVID. And I think it speaks exactly to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, thanks so much, as always, Gabriel, for providing all your insights. And thank you to the audience for tuning in to this video. But hopefully you will also log into acc.org and look at our journal scans, our trial summaries, news stories, all sorts of terrific content there about the ESC and just about cardiovascular disease in general.